So I warned you guys once before that I have to do these recordings for my school.
Yeah.
This is the last one, so everyone say, thanks, Brian.
Thanks, Brian.
That's my prof. He's a beauty, so we'll let it go this time. But we don't need this other than just to look at my ugly mug. So I think it's going. The last one worked, and it's on YouTube. So if you ever want to watch it again.
Or burn it.
I had to. It was the thing. Okay, so
How was it?
can you pass me my book there just behind you and those two things, yeah. That's what I need. So I'm quite I'm excited to talk about what we're going to talk about tonight, because it's off topic. So we've been doing these questions of faith, this series, kind of looking at an overarching question of why Jesus? Why would we as modern people follow this Jewish rabbi who claimed to be the Messiah, was crucified for such claims as well as the things that he did, and as Christians would believe rose again from the dead, and we follow his teachings and his will and his life in ours. So that's an overarching question. Why Jesus? Why would we do this thing called Christianity, following Christ? And so we've looked at some of the questions of, like, what is prayer was last week. We looked at the story of the prodigal son and this idea of being restored. So what does it mean to be restored or restored or reconciled? And themes of forgiveness have popped up. So this week I was going to talk about faith. What does it mean to have faith in a culture of skepticism and doubt? And I am really excited to talk about it, and we will pick the conversation up towards the end of October. But I don't know if you guys noticed this week the chaos in the news for our neighbors in the South. But there's a whole lot of stuff going on in the media about this hearing with Dr. Blasey Ford and Judge Kavanaugh. And so it's just dominated the news. And on Thursday afternoon, I saw it, and I just thought, man, one of the things I said was, like, when I do church, if I ever step out and do a church, I want to have the freedom to engage issues of our day and our culture in the sermon, rather than just be like, we're doing a series on Exodus, and you know what, like, something like, big is happening in the world, and the church just doesn't say anything about it. And I always felt like, no, it's important to address our cultural moment and our cultural issues. So that being said, without it dominating how we understand or how we believe, or what it is we communicate in a church service, right? We're not a political party. We follow the politics of Jesus, but that won't get you elected, nor can you vote for that, except for with your everyday actions and reactions to stuff. So we're not going to talk about the investigation and the he said, she said that's going on in this particular moment, but it kind of is going to act as a loose framework for what we are going to talk about. And on a bigger scale than just what's happening in the news, although we'll come back to it, is as I was thinking about this trial and all of the stuff that's going on, I kind of defined it as potentially like a hinge moment. And this is not, this is probably a real term, but it was something that just popped into my mind. It was like, Rick, you do cabinetry and stuff, and a huge door, the door opens, right? And it allows for exit and entry or whatever, and the door is what we see, but it's the tiny little hinges that are kind of tucked away. A good carpenter hides the hinges, tucks them away, right? So that you don't actually see them. But if it's not for the hinges, the door doesn't work. It doesn't open, it doesn't close. And so in history, I think the doors of history swing on these little, sometimes unforeseen or unseen hinge moments. And I feel like perhaps we're in the midst of a hinge moment now with what do we do with women who come forward with accusations from the past, and do we have a posture of skepticism or belief towards them? And what I want to look at to kind of frame our conversation is a few people. So here's our slide: hinge moments. The large doors of history swing on these hinge moments that are orchestrated by everyday people doing or, with daring acts of bravery. So a few kind of historical people that orchestrated hinge moments through ordinary living. Rosa Parks, you probably heard of her. She's an American from the South in Montgomery. And just behind her in this picture, you can see Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And Rosa Parks, if you don't know her story, she was an African-American woman in the time of segregation. So she got on her bus to come home from work, and she was tired. So she sat down on a seat that was reserved for whites only. And it kind of upset the norms of the day. African-American, black people couldn't sit in the whites-only section. She was tired and she sat down. Famously, a news reporter asked her, "Why did you do it? Why did you sit down?" And she said, "I was tired." And it's famous because she was tired. She just was. But she was also deeply tired of the systemic racism that said blacks had to sit at the back of the bus. So she sat in the seat and kind of turned the world upside down. It got her in with Martin Luther King. There was a whole event, a protest called the Montgomery bus boycotts that began because of her, because she sat down. Okay? Amazing woman. Changed the course of history. Civil rights movement in the United States came forward. She got connected with Martin Luther King Jr. And the rest, as they say, is history, although there's still work to be done. Who's heard of Viola Desmond? Yeah, interesting. Canadian Rosa Parks. Okay, so she's from Nova Scotia. She was a beautician, so she had like a hair salon and all this stuff with her husband. And she, on the way to taking beauty supplies to some convention or whatever, she was a hairdresser, right? And she was early for a ferry, or a ferry was canceled, so she went into the theater to watch a movie because she had like some time to kill. And so she sat down in the theater, bought a ticket, sat down, and it was like a white-only theater, right? Even in Canada, I know it's for some of us it's hard to believe. And so she was arrested and charged, and 45 years later, she received a pardon from the government of Canada. Or 45 years after her death, she received a pardon. And you will see Viola Desmond,
on the dollar bill.
that's right, on the $10 bill coming out, I think in March. So she will become a household name in Canada. And it's cool because it's not only the first ever banknote in Canada with an African-American woman or a person of color on it, but it's also the first ever vertical banknote. So it looks kind of flashy, like it's cool.
In this case, African-Canadian woman.
African-Canadian, thank you. Yeah, I said correctly. But yeah, so Viola Desmond, kind of a Canadian Rosa Parks, brought about a lot of attention to the fact that there was segregation in Canada, and that a woman who bought her ticket and sat in a theater to watch a movie was arrested and charged with like an offense against the law. So, pretty fascinating. One more that we'll look at, Nellie McClung. Anybody? This is like a bit of a history lesson.
Sounds familiar, but I can't remember why.
All right, so Nellie McClung is a civic election coming up, so all of the ladies in the room, you can say thank you to Nellie for pioneering women's suffragette, the right to vote for women in Canada. Now Nellie, she's an interesting lady, she's a Christian lady, bit of a badass though. She, she was a teacher, and in her school she did a mock parliament, and all of the prime minister, all of the political people were female students, and they had a referendum on if they should allow men to vote. So she basically, at the time when it was true in the other direction, she was like, we're going to do this, and we're going to see if, men, she said it might upset their disposition to have to enter into politics. So she used all these words that were being used in the culture to say, like, this is ludicrous. And eventually she pushed for women's suffragette and was one of the leading voices in getting women the right to vote in Canada. So amazing, right? Like, it's a pretty cool story that these women did simple acts of bravery, standing up for an injustice against themselves or against society around them. And they would be defined, I would define them as hinge moments. Like, we may not know them around a room to recall right away, not as famously perhaps like Rosa Parks or some of these people, but we recognize them for what they've done, more so by the way that doors of history have swung than their specific contribution. So Dr. Ford and Judge Kavanaugh, just a very contemporary, in-the-moment example of someone, a woman who is saying, this is what happened to me, and it's more than a conversation about did Judge Kavanaugh do these things or not. It's a conversation about how do we hear women who have been assaulted or alleged to have been assaulted. And so it's a broader conversation. I looked into it a little bit, just for your own information, from a reputable source, Hillary McBride. She is a clinical psychologist. A trauma skills workshop that I attended with her, she threw out a stat that between 2 and 10% of sexual assault allegations are false. But she said that it's much closer probably to the 2% based on the way if an allegation is put forth and then the person who, because it's not just women, the person who alleges the assault decides not to go forward with it or retracts it or just wants to leave it, it gets categorized as like an unsubstantiated claim. So her statistics would show it's closer to 2% of people that experience a sexual assault fake it or don't tell the truth, which I was like, oh man. Then she said, it's more numerically likely that someone would fake their own death based on the statistics than someone would make a false allegation of sexual assault. So I was like, wow, that's pretty sobering. So I just kind of thought that was interesting given the time that we're in. So hinge moments is kind of what we want to talk about tonight, and the idea that the large doors of history, these momentous occasions that, women voting, African Americans being granted citizenship, a cultural shift in how we view women who have been assaulted or are victims or alleging assault. These large moments of history swing on these minor hinge moments in terms of their scale, not their importance. And these moments are often orchestrated by ordinary people with daring acts of bravery. So that's a bit of a long introduction into what we're getting into, but it's an important setup to talk about the daughters of Zelophehad. So, how many of us have heard of the daughters of Zelophehad?
No.
Right? Kind of an obscure. When's the last time anyone read Numbers?
I knew the sons of Zelophehad.
Oh, you got outed. He had no sons.
Oh, okay.
So, daughters of Zelophehad, kind of an obscure story in the Old Testament, much like perhaps the obscure story of Viola Desmond or Nellie McClung, these ordinary women who stood up for something and changed the course of history. The daughters of Zelophehad we find in the book of Numbers, which is not just a clever name, it's a book of numbers. Okay, so it happens after the Exodus, and it's the story of Moses and the Israelites after being freed from Pharaoh. They're kind of wandering in the desert for a bit, and then they got to get organized. So in terms of like a thrilling narrative, it's not the best, but there are really, really important details, not just in the lineage of like counting the people, but in the way they were counted. And here's a little line that will help us remember some of the significance of today, is that to be counted means you count. Okay? Remember that. To be counted means that you count. So here in Numbers, it's in Numbers chapter 27, if you want to track along on your glowing Bible or in your real one. It's all good either way, no judgment here. But we're going to look at these 5 daughters of Zelophehad. Their names were Mahlah, Noah, Hoglah, Milcah, and Tirzah. So there's 5 daughters, and they emerge on the scene in Numbers chapter 27. Now, just a little bit of background on what's immediately happening in the context of our story. Numbers, as I said, is a book that's full of chronicling the people of Israel and separating them out by tribes based on the sons of the men. Okay, so it's a very patriarchal society, as was the custom, as was the norm for any ancient Near Eastern people group. So Numbers 27, we find these daughters of Zelophehad. It's post-Exodus. They're getting organized. There's future planning happening here. So what's really interesting is in chapter 26 and before this, Moses and Eleazar and Aaron, the kind of big boys, the priests and the chief priests, they are organizing the people and saying, you are going to inherit this land. But they haven't gotten to the land yet. So this is a future promise. And this is a twofold promise. This is both about real land that they're going to go in and take or conquer or have given to them through divine providence, which is another conversation. But they're going to receive this land one way or another, and they're going to actually move on to the physical space. This is also a bit of a conversation about future inheritance in a salvific form. So the promised land can both be understood as the real land and a euphemism for we are going to arrive as a people group into this salvation community, this place where we are going to be with and experience the good life with God. Okay, so there's kind of a twofold meaning there. So they're allotting out the land that will be. And they've counted all the people who count. And in Numbers 27, the daughters of Zelophehad approach Moses and the crew and kind of put their hand up and say, hang on a minute. This is their Rosa Parks moment. This is them sitting down on the bus. This is their Viola Desmond moment, going into the movie theater, or Nellie McClung saying, we need to rethink how we vote. And I just want to read you the story, so follow along with me, and then we're going to extrapolate some key things from the text, and then ask the questions like, so what? What does this mean for us today? Starting Numbers chapter 27. The daughters of Zelophehad, son of Hepher, son of Gilead, son of Machir, son of Manasseh, belonged to the clans of Manasseh, son of Joseph. So you might notice that there's already a lot of men being named. The names of the daughters were Mahlah, Noah, Hoglah, Milcah, and Tirzah. They approached the entrance to the tent of meeting and stood before Moses, Eleazar the priest, the leaders, and the whole assembly and said, our father died in the desert, but he was not among Korah's followers who banded together against the Lord, but he died for his own sin and left no sons. Why should our father's name disappear from his clan? Because he had no son. Give us property among our father's relatives. This is a bold claim, to be sure. Not only did they approach the tent of meeting, which is unheard of, these women coming up to where the Holy of Holies were, the Ark of the Covenant, the tablets with the commandments on it would have been held there. This was like holy and sacred ground. And these 5 women who were, there's no mention of their mother, their father's dead, so for all intents and purposes, they were single women who were orphans. So in the social stratosphere of the day, they were about as low as you could get in terms of importance. They boldly approach the throne. They boldly step towards Moses and the powers that be and say, give us what is ours. Give us property among our father's relatives. So Moses, oh, look at that. That's a good book. So Moses brings their case before God, we read in verse 5. Moses brought their case before the Lord. And the Lord said to him, what Zelophehad's daughters are saying is right. You must certainly give them an inheritance among their father's relatives and turn their inheritance over to them. God goes on saying to Moses, say to the Israelites, if a man dies and leaves no son, turn his inheritance over to his daughter. If he has no daughter, give his inheritance to his brothers. If he has no brothers, give his inheritance to his father's brothers. He goes on outlining this. He says, this is to be a legal requirement for the Israelites as the Lord commanded. So Moses brings this proposition from these 5 orphan daughters to God. And God says, what they're saying? Yeah, they're right. Give them their inheritance. And God goes one step further even and says, doesn't just say, hey, give them their inheritance. He says, from now on, whenever a father has no sons but has daughters, they will be inheritors. They will be ones who inherit land and money and all of the things that go along with it. A new law is given based on the boldness of the daughters of Zelophehad. Based on these 5 women coming up and saying to Moses, this is not fair. This is not just. And as good Israelite women, they recall their history. They say, our father was a good man. He didn't participate in this rebellion that happened against you. He was faithful. He died of his sin. A lot of commentaries say he just died from being human and wandering. The sin within you will take you before you reach the promised land. But no egregious offense was committed against the Lord or against Moses. So they harken back to their history and they say he was a good man. He just died of old age in the desert. Why should we suffer when we're here and we've done nothing wrong and he's done nothing wrong? Why should we not count? They weren't counted because they didn't count. And they said, that is not right. And they stepped forward to Moses to make this claim. Probably a great risk to themselves, and definitely, it was a definitely unprecedented, bold move to do. And Moses, we need to give Moses credit here. Because instead of just sticking with the patriarchy of the day and saying, this is what the Lord has commanded, deal with it, we are counting the sons of, which is what God says to Moses in Numbers chapter 1. God says, go and count the sons of, all of them who are able to serve in the military, count them, and from them we'll give inheritance. So Moses could have just said, God said to the sons, sorry ladies, get married, and then you'll have an inheritance. But he doesn't. Moses himself, as a man, as the spiritual leader of the Israelites, listens to their claim, and instead of just rejecting it, which he could have, based on the law that was given and based on the culture that he was in, he brings their case before God. And God says, yeah, what these 5 women are saying, it's right. Let's make some amendments to some of these laws. Father has no sons but has daughters, they get inheritance. It's a profound and radical step forward in a story that we could look at and say, what an ancient group of people who were so backwards, thinking that women were just property, or thinking that women, they didn't deserve inheritance because they were born women, and too bad if they didn't have any brothers to take care of them or husbands to take care of them. So we could look at those things in this story and say, man, the Old Testament is so backwards, women had no rights. They had nothing. What we find in this book of Numbers, this kind of boring record of who goes where and who inherits what, we find this dynamic story of God's radical, progressive, loving nature. And it's mind-blowing because in the culture of the day, like I say, the law was set. Moses could have said, no way, you get what you get and you don't get upset. This is what Naya's ballet teacher says to her. She's very, you get what you get and you don't get upset. So I'm back, yeah, Gabriella. So great. Oh man. So instead of that, though, Moses hears their complaint, hears their injustice, and takes it to the Lord, and the Lord speaks and says, we're going to change the law to give favor to these women who were otherwise outsiders. So what is the good news for us? The good news for Theo is that dinner's coming. What is the good news for us in this ancient story in a day where, we don't have segregated buses anymore and women can vote if they choose to, and we're moving forward in a way of having real time, like as we're living right now in this culture moment, conversations about what do we do with allegations and accusations from the past, from women that years ago, a couple decades ago, a couple generations ago, wouldn't have gotten media attention or Supreme Court attention based on the cultural climate of our day. So what is the good news for us as we kind of look at this trajectory of growth, this arc that humanity is on? A couple things that I want to draw out from the story is that God appears to be on the side of the underdog. God is in favor of human flourishing. And God is making room where there wasn't room before based on God's own laws, which is fascinating and has big implications if we track through. The second thing that I think we can see as good news for us as 21st century people is that we need to remember in the ebb and flow, we sang the song, Everything is Sacred, in the ebb and flow of our lives and our moments, our lives and our days, hinge moments, these hinge moments that the doors of history swing on, are orchestrated by ordinary people who, like God, have a heart for or are the underdogs. They are the oppressed. They aren't the victors. They aren't the ones with the political power and might. They aren't the ones who can affect change. They are the ones who desire and long for change to be effective. They are ordinary people. They are you and me. They are ordinary people who say enough is enough. We need to change the world. I think that there's lots of examples of people who have changed the world that are atheists, that are Buddhist, that are just secular people. But it's interesting to me that as I thought through 3 women, which was on purpose, but 3 women who made significant changes in our kind of modern era, all 3 of them were Christian. All 3 of them followed the example of God, said injustice should not stand. And they weren't just saying that from a humanist perspective, like we should just be nice to each other. They were saying it from a perspective of we have these stories where God says injustice shall not stand. And so we as God's people, Rosa Parks, Nellie McClung, Viola Desmond, as God's people, we recognize the heart of God is for the oppressed, is for the orphan, is for the widow, is for the underdog. And that as a society, as humanity, to trend towards what's better, we need to share the heart of God for those people. There's an arc. There's a trajectory, a forward movement to our humanity, and I think that's really good news. To go from the Old Testament to the New Testament, where there's violence and kill your enemies, to Jesus saying, turn the other cheek and love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. The crazy idea that the patriarchal system of the day is not what dominated this story, but it was the radical progressive grace of God that said to Moses, these women are right, and we're going to change the law to reflect that justice and to reflect creating an inheritance, both, again, in terms of the actual physical land they were moving into and the communally shared inheritance of the picture of salvation, which is what we get with Jesus too. As followers of Christ, we're promised, we say again, right, that you make all things new, new life, new beginnings, new heaven and new earth. And so it's a promise that we can lean into for our lives here and now, because we know this. We have this. We can see injustices, we can experience injustices, and we can choose to bring the shalom, the peace, and the wholeness, and the justice of God into those moments, into our lives. And we can make a difference. Lord, let your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. We can make a difference now for God's kingdom by living as justice-oriented people, making these hinge moments. And it's also a promise that Jesus gives us for an eternity of fulfillment spent with him. And one is not better than the other. One is not the point over the other. Both are the most beautiful gift. That we get the land we're moving towards, that we get to move towards it, physically walk on the dust and the earth and move into it and cultivate it and do all this good work. But it's also this collective and individual transformation and salvation found through the goodness of God's heart, which is most clearly showed by Jesus on the cross. That God so loved the world that he would die even for his enemies, even at the hands of those who said he was our enemy. And Jesus would die for us that we would experience here and now and the not yet realized promised lands of faith. So to me, that's remarkably good news. And I hope that links up with you and syncs up with where you're at. But if you have to take anything away from tonight, I would encourage you to remember that through Jesus, we're given an opportunity to stand boldly. We come before the throne of God. We are the people of God. We are the throne of God. And we stand before a God whose heart longs for justice and mercy and love and other-oriented love that we see reflected in Jesus. So, like the boldness of these 5 daughters, these 5 women who stood up for their own sake, but also for the sake of all the other women like them who weren't counted because they didn't count. So we want to count everyone, because in God's economy, in God's kingdom, everybody counts, everybody matters. And so for us to be a people of generous space and gracious love, we want to live oriented in the way of Jesus, which is to be for everyone and with everyone. So they would see and know the goodness of God and have that transform their lives, to be people who would go out and then transform the lives of others. And they would go out and transform the lives of others. And however many years down the road, we would see God's transformative power in millions of people. It's insane, but this is what God can do with a little bit of faith on our part, a little bit of boldness, and a desire to be hinges that change the course of history. So it's a Lego battle. Let me pray, and then we can eat and do dessert and have coffee and all that good stuff. Lord Jesus, thank you that we have these stories recorded that are interesting narratives. They're records of numbers and names, and yet in the midst of that, there's these beautiful stories of freedom and grace and love. And so, God, as we orient ourselves towards you, we recognize that you will orient ourselves towards others, which is an example of this story. So may we be as bold as the daughters of Zelophehad. May we have the wisdom of Moses to bring these things to you, O Lord. And may we be able to hear your voice when you speak to us and act accordingly to your will through your purposes. For the sake of your glory and your name, Jesus, we pray. Amen. There you go. A little bit more of a monologue tonight, but I appreciate you guys tracking with that. Thoughts, concerns, questions, comments, brownies?
At the art gallery at Fraserview, they have a display of the different women of faith from our heritage, from Russia,
Okay.
that had to come to Canada. I was just looking at it today. There's a little thing on the screen on that. Quite interesting.